I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Major General Phillip Stewart, a senior military officer with the U.S. Air Force. In his most recent roles as military senior officer, he commanded both NATO's and the Air Force's high-altitude drone wings, and was also an expert on European and NATO military policy and the architect of NATO's military response to Russian aggression. Major General Stewart has commanded at multiple levels, including 3 times as a wing commander, twice in combat, and held numerous staff duty roles in the USAFE, on the Joint Staff, and at the Air Combat Command. He's held command roles in NATO, served as an instructor and evaluator pilot in multiple aircraft, and has over 600 hours of combat airtime and flown across 168 combat missions. Major General Stewart holds 3 master's degrees and a BA from Georgia Tech, and has been awarded the NATO Meritorious Service Medal, Defense Superior Service Medal, Bronze Star, Air Medal, Legion of Merit, Combat Readiness Medal, and many other awards and honors. He's also the only military, civilian, or industry leader to be a 3-time finalist for the Collier Trophy, presented annually by the air and space industry for the most outstanding feat in military or civilian aviation. So before we get into it, I should do a disclaimer. The views presented by Major General Stewart today are his alone and are not representative of the United States Air Force, Department of Defense, or the United States government. So Phil, welcome, sir. It is truly an honor and a pleasure. I want to start, before anything else, by thanking you for your tremendous career of service, sir.
Well, the honor is mine, and thanks for the invite. I love talking air power.
Yeah, it's a remarkable topic, and there's so much transformational change happening right now.
You're right about that.
So you were commissioned by the Air Force back in 1992 and rose to the rank of Major General and the role of Commander of a Numbered Air Force, as well as being an expert on both drone warfare and NATO military policy. I mean, again, a tremendous and diverse background. I'm wondering if I could start by asking, what are some of your accomplishments and achievements that you have been most proud of over the course of this lengthy career?
Well, it's funny. I know we're going to talk about the transformation later in your show, but I spent the first half of my career as a fighter pilot. I was trained for that, and I was very proud of that. And then it was only later, for reasons we'll get into later, that I transferred into intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, drones, but also manned and unmanned, both fleets of that. And then as you get older, you become a senior leader, you get more into policy. And that. Yeah. But of the things I've done, I think I'm most proud of a program called the MC-12, which was a rapid acquisition program started in the early 2000s, spearheaded by the Secretary of Defense, and it was a program to get tactical intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance onto the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan. We were losing a large number of folks to IEDs. And we also had a large number of special ops troops that were deep in and needed help. And so it was a program to turn essentially a King Air, this is the model of it, a King Air plane into, which is an executive transport plane, which we fielded in only 8 months and turned it into a tactical ISR platform. It turned out to be the fastest fielding of a weapon system since the P-51 in World War II. So I was very proud of that, but what I'm most proud of about that whole program is in the 5 years it existed, we never lost a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine that had MC-12 coverage in the battlefield. We were able to save lives, and that means a lot to someone who spent a lot of time in combat. So there's a lot of Navy SEALs, Army Delta Force, and folks that are walking around today, or maybe even unwounded, because of the protection that we were able to provide. The early warning of an ambush, for instance, or an IED that was buried in the road. And that program was a large program involved. But I know you have an intense interest in rapid acquisition and using high tech. Well, sometimes high tech is just low tech done many different ways, right? That's how you can get it done. And it's hard to take a great idea and transform it into something that can be used on the battlefield. And we were able to do that in, like I said, 8 months. 6 months was the goal, by the way. We were 2 months late, but it still was by today's standards, that's that's incredibly fast. We were nominated for the Collier Trophy for that for my team. So you said I was a 3-time finalist, which is a polite way of saying I'm a 3-time loser. So, we lost once to Sully Sullenberger, once to the International Space Station, and once to the Mars rover program. And that is very good company. So I'm excited to even be the teams that I was on were in those names. So I'm just teasing you, Tim.
Yeah, I was going to say, you have such an impressive collection of awards and honors. I had trouble reading them all, and that's not all of them, right? That was just kind of where I started. I was like, okay.
When I say I'm a 3-time finalist, I was joking. It's just like the Buffalo Bills going to the Super Bowl.
Well, let me ask about challenges in your career, because again, you've done command in combat, wing, base, and training. So this incredible breadth, depth, and diversity of experience there. What have some of the most challenging roles been? And when I was writing that question, my thought was, most people would say, "Oh, I bet combat is the most challenging," but peacetime can be challenging as well, right?
Right, and the challenges get harder as you appreciate and rank. The MC-12 program I talked about was difficult because we had to, whenever you feel something fast, you have to take risk, right? And that is one of the hardest jobs of a senior leader, is how much risk to take, and how much is too much. We ended up losing 4 airmen under my command. We didn't lose anybody we were protecting, but we were so far in advancing that over the course of the 5-year program, 4 airmen lost their lives, and I take that very seriously, and that's a weight and scars that I still carry, as do others. Other challenges, I think, were the NATO Global Hawk, so standing up that program. That was challenges for a different reason, right? U.S. drones don't have an airworthiness certificate, so anything that flies, if you're going to fly in international space, you need an airworthiness certificate, which means a bureaucracy of some sort has licensed it to fly. U.S. drones don't have that because they're experimental aircraft, believe it or not. That's how we get around that, and the FAA. But when NATO bought Global Hawks, they were going to fly in European airspace, which is governed differently. And they required what's called an airworthiness certificate. And getting that done was extraordinarily challenging. Italy did that on behalf of the NATO alliance. Sometimes that's how it works in NATO. A nation will pick up a task. And working with NATO to provide the first ever airworthiness certificate for a drone, that involved millions of documents that had to be certified officially. That was a heavy lift. And then just writing the laws and the regulations to permit an ISR asset to fly over countries. Not every nation's comfortable with it. But that was being done on behalf of NATO. That doesn't mean all the NATO nations were digging the fact that a spy plane was going to be flying over their territory, and we spent lots of times not on a military issue but on a political issue, right? Saying, hey, this is what it will be doing, what it won't be doing. You will have total insight into it.
That reminds me of something one of my early mentors had said to me years ago. I worked at AT&T Wireless, right? And they had a really deep management hierarchy. And one of my mentors had said to me one day, he said, "Tim, the hardest thing to do is change scope." And what you're talking about with the Global Hawk reminds me the same thing, because you have to have a solid understanding of, how it's going to be used, the missions that are to be flown on, the personnel who are going to be using it, right? You have to be able to fully understand that program. But then what you're talking about with the airworthiness certificate is it's a whole nother level of your bureaucracy and red tape that you have to be able to push that through. And you have to juggle this, in your head the entire time. So
you just can't go, beep beep, superpower coming through, everyone out of the way. Yeah. That works in a wartime environment. You can do that, but as you just said, when you're trying to bring things to scale, flying in a peacetime environment over nations which you don't have sovereignty, it was a difficult lift, but it was extremely rewarding. And that program is doing very well over in NATO over there now. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and actually, I was going to ask about, since you mentioned wartime, if it's okay, I wanted to ask about the change in focus, I guess, because back when you were commissioned in 1992, the U.S. was still primarily focused on potential Cold War European conflicts, right, with Russia and the former Soviet states. And we pivoted to desert warfare with Afghanistan and Iraq. And from what I understand, we are changing our focus again to look more heavily at the South Pacific, right? The tensions in the Taiwan Strait with China. So there has been a lot of change, and these are very different environments. Um, from a command perspective, has it been difficult? Has it been a challenge for the aircraft logistics and personnel to adapt to the unique demands of these incredibly different environments?
Not that it's a challenge. That you're still going to need air superiority in any conflict, right? Whether it's over the desert or over the ocean, you're still going to need logistics. You're still going to need, bombs, bullets, beans. You're going to need to get those to the fight. You're going to need all those things. So I don't know that it's different due to the geography. I think what's difficult and what has proven difficult is, are you prepared for what? Right? We get this question all the time in Congress. Are you prepared? Right? General Stewart, are you prepared for your mission? Well, prepared for what? Will we prepared for 9/11 as a nation? Probably not, right? Otherwise, we would have stopped it. So, we try very hard, as senior officers in the military and all of the think tanks and all of the policymakers. But the question is, are you prepared for what? And let me kind of step away from this a little bit. So, the last time prior to the Ukraine war, the last time two peer-to-peer land battles had been fought, two nations, was probably the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in the 1990s,
okay,
35 years ago. The last time two peer air powers fought was probably Korea. You could make a case that the Yom Kippur War in the 70s, you could maybe say the 70s and the Vietnam War, but really Korea was the last time two modern air forces collided. And the last time two modern navies collided was the Battle of the Coral Sea, in World War II. There has never been a major naval battle since then. So even though I've been in for 32 years and I believe we are prepared, are we? I don't know. Do you? There's no. It's all theory, right?
Yeah.
It's all theory. And yes, we've been at war for 20 years, and yes, I got 169 combat sorties, but most of those were very short periods of high intensity or low intensity conflicts or small wars or whatever counterinsurgency. You can pick your term. But the point is, we don't really know what we don't know. I think we're prepared, but what keeps me up at night isn't the different domains, if you will. It's what's next, what's coming next. And I know your podcast and your listeners appreciate it because you focus on that, right?
Yeah. And, if I could jump in, when you mentioned this keeping you up at night, I've done several interviews with senior military leaders, and all of them have said that. These are things that you think about that do keep you up at night. And for me, that's reassuring, right? It's not a 9 to 5. It's not, okay, right. I've done my work, I'm going home for the day. It's what could potentially be done on top of this. What did we potentially miss? What could potentially happen that we're not taking into account? And that is one of the things that gives me such tremendous awe and respect for the United States military, as well as the leadership staff like yourself, because you guys are always when the
stakes are very, and I am blessed to take part in a military that has been well funded. The quality of the people that join it, that are part of it, I am blown away by the quality of the young men and women, even the 18-year-olds. Right out of school, that caliber of individual, it's a treasure and a resource. So it's an honor to do that.
Well, let me get into air power strengths a little bit. I did some research on this. I'm crossing my fingers that my numbers aren't wrong because I worked from several different resources. Right. I went to Wikipedia. Rand Corporation had several publications online. And, one of the challenges is a lot of these are estimates to begin with. And then, you go a few months and the numbers may have changed. But from what I was able to find, the U.S. Air Force is the world's largest air force with roughly 5,300 aircraft. The second largest air force in the world belongs to the U.S. Navy with 3,700 aircraft. So we're winning on both counts. Our aircraft are also far more advanced than our adversaries, and I think that's important to point out. We've got about 500 F-22 and F-35 fifth-generation fighter aircraft, and in contrast, China has around 3,150 military aircraft altogether. About 2,400 of those are fighter aircraft, and the Russian Air Force has 4,255 aircraft, only about 1,500 fighters. So China and Russia, the technology is lagging ours, and we have larger numbers than both of our adversaries, right?
I think that's right. So well, you are correct. Our planes are better. Let me just put it that way. Okay, but more important than that, though, is our pilots are better. And we lose sight of this because I'm just like you. I'm a tech nerd, and I love depth. I love high tech, but we cannot forget that when it comes to warfare, in particular, it's the people, not the machines, that you have to invest in, and the training of those people. And we'll get back to that, I think, later in your show. But even with that said, the question is, are we investing in the right technologies, right? So we do have a qualitative and quantitative advantage over both Russia and China, but for how much longer, right? I mean, China is just pouring a ton of money into this, and they have different models, by the way, that they use. But in neither case, is either Russia or China or any of the other nations, do they have the quality of the folks that we have. All right. And not just pilots, by the way. It's the NCO Corps, our ability to grow a non-commissioned officer corps, sergeants. All right. Career enlisted folks. No other nation has that, right? That is a asymmetric advantage in people that the U.S. has. And by the way, Russia and China will never have that because you can't have that in an authoritarian nation. That's a different discussion. We could go into that on a different podcast. But the incredible investment we make in our non-commissioned officers, and the amount of the leadership we give them, and so just a quick example: if you were in the Russian military, you are either a young enlisted person or you're a conscript, and you report to an officer. There's no one in between, right? That officer tells you what to do, and if that officer doesn't tell you what to do, you do nothing. Okay, that's why they're getting their butts kicked in Ukraine, right? But in our military, we have decentralized, and so it's run by small units that make decisions. Even a young fighter pilot flying a plane makes their own decisions. And authoritarian governments don't let their people make decisions, so they'll never have that advantage. So it's a mix, but I still think it's the quality and the training that we give our people that is more important than the technology. All that said, you can't fall behind too far in technology. Either.
Well, and so in terms of technology, and this definitely isn't as number heavy, but I've read that China is working to upgrade their Air Force to fourth generation fighters. So those are behind ours in general. But the rumor that I've heard, at least, is that a lot of those are powered by older engines. And so they're not exactly fourth generation. And then, interestingly, when I was doing research on this, I'd read that Russia may have lost up to 25% of its combat aircraft during Ukraine. So,
I think you're in the ballpark.
Yeah. So we're still out in front. That's
right. And so they use different models, first off. So Russia has a very clever model. They knew they couldn't beat us in technology and mass production. They build the planes, but they don't mass produce them. So that allows them to keep ahead of the technology. But that hurts them because they don't have the pilots to fly them as much. They may have a handful trained, but they don't mass produce. China does almost the opposite. China mass produces, and then they don't. They'll skip a generation or two, and then they catch back up. So it's interesting. It's two separate models, actually three if you include ours, for how to do it. Again, I don't. I think you're seeing this in the Ukraine that they're not, and we'll talk about this later, but they're not. The Russians are not using air power very well at all, and I think that's a result of the fact that they don't have the people to do it. Again, let's use China. I mean, China is in building these carriers right now, right? It's no secret. Not just modern airplanes and sixth-gen airplanes, but they're building nuclear carriers. Fantastic. That's great. That bothers me. But where are they getting the captains to sail to sail a carrier? Right. That takes generations to build that capability. So you have to not just focus on how good is the plane, how good is the ship, but how good are the people that are flying it? How good are your commanders that are leading it? Otherwise, it won't do any good.
Well, and that is something that is unique to the United States. And
100%.
what I wanted to ask about, though, was I guess the kind word would be technology transfer, but maybe a more accurate word would be military espionage. One of the things I've done several intelligence interviews as well, and one of the major concerns is that technology information might be taken from like military contractors and basically anywhere that it can be found and transferred back to China. And when they just unveiled their new 6th generation fighter, this was I think last week, one of the first things that I saw online was people saying, that looks suspiciously familiar. So yeah. I mean, is that kind of an ongoing concern? I know that the Air Force and the DoD have done a lot to address that already.
Yeah, they don't look a little similar. They look exact, right? There's a picture I saw in the last Air and Space Symposium where they had it was half of the picture was a US F-35 and the other half was China's new plane. And then when you put them together, it looked exactly the same, right? So you could not be more spot on, Tim. It's a serious problem, and it's doing great damage to the United States. And it's an area that we need to focus on. And not just that, but cyber attacks too, right? So I'm a military guy. I'm not a policy. I'm not advocating for policy. But there was a time in our history, in the 1700s and the 1800s, where merely stopping a U.S. merchant ship was an act of war, right? And why was that? Because it was a breach of sovereignty. We recognized that even though it wasn't a warship firing on a warship, you were impacting our communications, our trade, our economy. And I think we're there again, but we're behind, right? We don't view a cyber attack as an act of war sometimes. We don't view that, but we need to start looking at it that way, right? We need to get serious about industrial espionage, foreign nations stealing secrets from the industrial power base, and cyber attacks. They go on every day. You read about them every day. Yeah. And I'm not saying we don't do anything about it, because certainly we do, but do we treat it as a kinetic attack? We don't. We don't give it the right. And I know there's legal reasons why, and again, we can't go into that in this podcast, but I think we need to start looking at it that way, because you are exactly right. It is a grave danger to the United States to let our industrial-based secrets get stolen and give those nations that are behind a leg up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to pivot a little bit and go back to older technology. The Fairchild A10 Thunderbolt 2, which is on its way out because it lacks advanced technology that's found in the F-35. And I'd asked about that when I first read the story. They said they were taking that out of service eventually, right?
Right.
And I was like, why? That has been such a remarkable aircraft. And someone looked at me very seriously and said, Tim, it just can't compete in terms of the technology. It's becoming kind of a target. So that one is interesting. Do you think it's being retired too soon, or does that older design, does it still have some merit to it, I guess?
Well, I wouldn't say it's the platform that's important. As long as you have, it's the mission and the capability. Right? Close air support, which is the mission of the A10. It does close air support, doesn't do deep strike, it doesn't do air superiority, it doesn't do any of those missions. The ability to do close air support is a mission that the U.S. Air Force will never walk away from. But I'm not speaking for the U.S. Air Force, but I can tell you that we won't. We're very proud of that mission. And again, you're saving the lives of American soldiers. So the question is it done by an A10 or is it done by something else? So the A10 will eventually go away. I don't know when that is, but I know for a fact that when it does go away, it will be replaced by something that does. And again, I don't think low tech is bad. I mean, we just talked about this earlier on the show. I mean, just a couple of years ago, this is an A29. This is what I was an air advisor in Afghanistan. Okay, what does that look like? It looks like a World War II fighter, right?
Yeah.
It's from the move. But we had some laser guided bombs and some laser guided rockets, and that is very low tech. But was that doing great work on the battlefields of Afghanistan? Of course it was. And could you train an Afghan fighter pilot to fly that in less than a year, you could. So again, it's not always high tech is great. Sometimes low tech is what you need. So I think I focused on the mission, and the A10 is such a great platform. In fact, I know we're going to talk later about some other older platforms which are still doing the job, right?
Yeah,
and they're around
in fact,
because they do it well. So
if it's okay, I want to go to that next.
Let's
The
do it.
thing that brought the A10 to mind was you had mentioned when we were discussing doing the podcast, you'd mentioned commanding the Global Hawks, the RQ-4 Global Hawk unmanned aircraft systems, right? And so those are drones that are used for reconnaissance, but you also commanded Lockheed U-2 spy planes.
Right.
And I was like, those are still around? So I did research. They haven't made those since 1989. My mother has stories from newspaper headlines from the 1950s, right?
Yeah.
The Eisenhower administration, But what I'm wondering there is the capabilities the Global Hawk and NRO satellite imaging encroach on that U-2. I mean, is that something that will be on its way out, or are we going to have those indefinitely, do you
It goes
think?
back to the capability, and
Yeah,
you're right.
yeah.
The stories I have. So one of my good friends was Gary Powers' roommate. Gary Powers in 1959 was flying the U-2. All right, and it's still flying. So the U-2, the C-130, and the B-52 are in a race to see which one will be operational for 100 years, right? And all three will probably get there. To me, that is fascinating. I don't think the U-2 will be replaced by satellites. Maybe replaced
okay.
by drones. Now, and I'll tell you why. So if a plane's flying that long, it must be doing something right, right? So the C-130 is fantastic at cargo, right? The B-52 is a great long-range bomber, but the U-2. Why is the U-2 such a great plane? Because it's almost like a pickup truck when it comes to intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. It's size, weight, and power. What the builders of the U-2 did so well is that the plane is just big enough that it carries really big generators and coolers, right? And so it can lift a sensor. And so on a plane, it's a beautiful plane, right? The U-2 looks great, but it's big enough. But the plane that Gary Powers flew in the 50s, that's not your father's Oldsmobile. This is not your father's U-2. All right. I mean, it's got the satellite uplink on it. It's got other links. It's got database, but it's a pickup truck. And I'll get back to this later on in the podcast on why that's important. Because the sensors on the U-2 are probably 9 to 10 times more expensive than the actual U-2. In other words, this U-2 just flying around the skies of California, maybe $100 million. All right. But you put sensors on there and it's close to $1 billion. All right.
Okay.
So those sensors are exquisite, the ones that are made by the U.S. Intelligence Agency, and they can, there's dozens of different sensors. They could be electro-optical, they could be hyperspectral, multispectral. But what makes the U-2 powerful is that it lands and you swap out the sensors. All right. You need synthetic aperture radar. We got that today. Okay. You need EOIR. We got that tomorrow. You need hyperspectral. We got that. In a satellite, you can't do that, right? You launch a satellite, and you're kind of stuck with what you got when you launch that satellite, unless you put multiple sensors on there. So there's a flexibility. We have a saying in air power: flexibility is the key to air power. So there's a flexibility built into the U-2 as a reconnaissance plane that it's a pickup truck that has high levels of size of SWaP-C, if you could, size, weight, power, and cooling. That has made it so flexible. Now, the drones that they're building these days can also do the same thing. So you may replace it with drones, but don't undersell the flexibility of being able to change what your different sensors are, because there's some exquisite ones out there.
Yeah, well, and again, from a command perspective, then you're able to outline the mission and say, okay, this is what we need to see. This is where it needs to go. And then, somebody below that can say, okay, these are the sensors that are needed.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for years, the satellites are predictable. Now, there's a whole revolution that's already started in microsatellites, right? The same revolution that miniaturized the size, weight, power, and cooling of the sensors is now what lets you put it on a satellite and get it into space for the low cost per pound. So those two things are advancing at the same time. So some of what you're saying is true. Large amounts of the reconnaissance world will be sent to space because of that. In fact, I think probably inside the next decade, probably the the portions of the globe below the 65 latitudes, 100% of that will be active to full motion video all the time. In other words, policymakers in whatever capital you might be in the US or Europe will be able to lock onto a satellite and watch full motion video of any place in the globe at one time. That capability was fascinating. I mean, you remember in the early days of Iraq and Afghanistan when we were flying Predators, right? And you would look down the soda straw at the feed of the Predator, and people were mesmerized by that. Wow, we are looking into the desert in Afghanistan, you know? Imagine being able to do that in any part of the world, anytime you want, within a decade. That's coming.
Yeah, the technology is changing so rapidly.
Unbelievable.
So, yeah. Well, let me ask about drones, because in terms of future goals, I understand the DoD has set China's rapid buildup as a pacing challenge, right? And so today's fifth generation fighter, the F-35, is anticipated to be in service through the year 2044. These are manned vehicles. They're expensive to produce. They will be around for a while. And so I'm wondering if programs like the Loyal Wingman, that combines a traditional fighter like the F-35 with a swarm of unmanned drones, could help increase our strength in numbers and air power capabilities.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in the CCA and the other drone programs that are out there. I mean, obviously I was born into it, right? So the Air Force was sort of dragged begrudgingly into the drone era. But now that it's there, it's fully invested in that, and we've grown. I pinned the wings on the first RPA only pilot. So the first drone pilot, they have their own wings now. In 2012, and it was a brand new career field, and now we're just growing them into the general's career field to bring it in. So again, remember, you can't forget the people when you grow the technology. But I'm a big believer in CCA. Remember, I just talked about the U-2 being a pickup truck, essentially, right? And you swap out the sensors. Well, when you talk the collaborative combat aircraft, the vision of the Pentagon now for the paired wingman series, you know, what is that CCA going to hold? You know, is it going to hold missiles? Probably. Is it going to hold fuel? Probably. Is it going to hold maybe jamming? Yeah, sure. You know, so again, you build that flexibility into the drone, so now it can be used. And I just think that is, I commend the leaders in the Pentagon for having the foresight to try to drive that home, because it is the future, right? Whether you want to buy it or not. If there's a lot of lessons from Russia, we may get there later on, the Russia-Ukraine war, but you cannot deny that the future of warfare lies in drones. One of them.
Yeah,
not the only
absolutely.
One, certainly one of them.
Well, this goes exactly to what you said about flexibility. Also, you know, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can have these hybrid combinations that really, you know, they bring out the best of both worlds,
That's
right? You can have the manned aircraft, like you were saying. You might be able to bring fuel along with it,
right?
And this is jumping around in my questions a little bit, but one of the other things I'd wondered about was being able to automate things like refueling tankers. In fact, I have some statistics buried down in my questions list. But you know, we have tons and tons of aircraft that are not combat aircraft; they're support aircraft, right? And they have crews, and I think that those missions are oftentimes considered tedious. They're long missions. I'd wondered about automation for those.
Yeah, I love that question, and I know you're a futurist combined with your tech background, so only a man like you would think about that, and your audience knows that. I love that idea, right? And again, to me, just spitballing, it's again, the mix of high tech and low tech is ripe right here. Right, for instance, imagine a dirigible, a solar-powered dirigible, way back in the days, right, the pre-World War I days. But you could, UPS could make a dirigible now powered by solar, and it could get from LA to New York flying at a reasonable rate. The engines are already commercial off the shelf in 2 or 3 days, right? Completely unmanned. And think of the cargo that could hold, right? Think of the fossil fuels you wouldn't need to burn anymore, but for UPS or for FedEx. And the military could do that too. So there's commercial and military logistics into what you're saying. The use of drones in the maritime environment, not exactly my expertise, but you can see where that would play in as well. You know, these drone ships, they become more and more automated anyway. The commercial, container ships you see out there are more and more automated already. But there's tremendous growth opportunity here. And so I'm excited about that future as well. And again, it doesn't always have to be high tech. That's why I love the dirigible idea. Right, the balloons, for God's sakes. And folks, you say you can't do it. Remember, did China just fly a balloon? A spy balloon, for God's sakes. Remember that 2 years ago? How low tech is that? Is that the lowest tech? They put it into the Gulf Stream and it flew across, and it was so low tech, it was hard to see. You know?
Yeah.
But it worked, right? So we have to learn from that. That not everything has to cost $1 billion. That you only need the technology to be at an advanced level to achieve the mission. So I love that question you just asked. I think it is not the future. I think it needs to be the now, because you need to look for cost savings too. And believe it or not, a solar powered dirigible would be pennies on the dollar for what we pay currently for a transport plane. So does everything need to get there tomorrow? I don't think so. You know?
Well, the reason I'd ask that was, when people think of drones, I think their mind natively goes to combat, right? Because that's what we see. You go on like Twitter or social media and you see these Ukraine war images of drones zipping around, with weapons, and they are incredibly impressive, and there's definitely a future there. But my thought was, is there a way to approach autonomy that is less controversial and just easier to implement? And I thought, cargo and refueling, that's the place to start.
I think you're spot on. And the peaceful use of drones, to me, is where the future of drones is really at. Relieving the human for some of the more menial tasks that can be better and more accurately or even safer performed by a drone. I think there's a lot of research to be done there, and there's a lot of hay to be made there.
Well, so going to Ukraine, this is an area where it feels like the U.S. may be lagging. Ukraine is driving the rapid evolution of small, inexpensive kamikaze drones of all shapes and sizes. And then Russia's new Oresnik missile highlights, I think, both Russian and Chinese growing capabilities with hypersonic missiles. So I wanted to ask, in terms of those areas, are we behind a little bit? And I don't think that would be by any oversight. I think it's just the rapid evolution that's coming through necessity.
Yeah, I don't know that we're behind. So there's kind of two separate questions there. The use of kamikaze drones, that just rolls off the tongue now. But if you go back to Nagorno-Karabakh, the war in 2023 there, that was brand new. Remember, we hadn't seen a land warfare in a long time, which preceded the Ukraine war by about a year. And I remember seeing reports of suicide drones being used. So I come from this field, right? So I turned to my intel officer and I said, "What's the difference between a cruise missile and a suicide drone?" And
well, that's a good question.
And I was like, and I didn't know. That's why I was asking it. And I got a lot of, I said, "You don't know either. Go back and research it and come back and let me know." And there isn't one, right? A cruise missile is simply a modified plane with a bomb on it, right? It's oversimplified. And so someone managed to turn a drone into the same thing, and so we started seeing this sort of inventions, if you will, very early on in the Ukraine, right? The loitering munitions, those are deadly to tanks and armored vehicles, right? They just loiter above, and they have maybe a hand grenade or a shaped charge. They've gotten more sophisticated in the last year, but these were soldiers on the battlefield, necessity being the motherhood of invention kind of a thing. And they're completely lethal. So I don't know that we're behind. Only remember that in one of your earlier questions, when I said, "Are we prepared? Prepared for what?" We weren't prepared.
Exactly.
And so I don't. And we're trying to get there now. But there's a lot of work and real time work being done by a lot of different nations to capitalize on the military use of drones in the better way to do that. So it just, again, it goes back to something as low tech as high tech, right? The cruise missile was the high tech solution. A suicide drone is the low tech solution. Okay, when you need a solution now and you really, really need it bad, they went with low tech, and it's been effective. So we're going to go back to that. Your question about cruise missiles and hypersonics, it to me is a fascinating area of study. You could have a separate podcast just on that. And just for the folks who don't know the difference, so you have ballistic missiles, which are just, imagine someone shooting a 3-point shot in basketball, right? They've been around, it goes up and it comes back down. It's ballistic, hence the name, right? And you have short range, intermediate range, long range, and of course the dreaded ICBM, the intercontinental ballistic.
Yeah.
But they just differ in their size. But the technology is not really high there. It's rocketry, right? You know where they've launched, and they're relatively easy to target, right? Because once they go up in the apex, you know where it's going. So that part's pretty easy. And more importantly, you know where it's going to go bang. and so you can target it, and you see this all the time, right? And you saw how Israel shot down 300 of them that Iran launched at them, right? And you see them all the time in Kyiv, but that's different than a cruise missile, which comes in low and slow, very hard to target, very hard to see because they're only at 100 feet, and you don't know where it's going. Unlike a ballistic missile, we can tell where it's going. Cruise missile's dangerous because you don't know where the bang is going to go until the bang happens, right? So you have to get there beforehand. When people talk hypersonics, what they're really talking about is hypersonic cruise missiles, okay? Because all ballistic missiles are hypersonic by nature.
Okay.
Hypersonic just means Mach 5, right? So if you're I should say all ballistic missiles, but most of them are. They come in much faster than that. So when people talk, your question, and I'm sorry for the long answer, when they talk hypersonics, what they're really getting at is the ability to get in low and fast and untargetable in a place where people don't know where it's going to hit, and that is a terrifying from the defensive posture. So I don't know that we're behind there, but we're not as advanced as I would like, put it that way. And the technology is different. Again, this is the area when I talked about earlier is what are we investing in? Okay, so let's talk stealth for a second. Why do we have a stealth Air Force? What does stealth do that we need it to do? Okay, the answer is it turns a non-permissive environment into a permissive environment, right? That's all it does. Right? There's a reason you want stealth. You have to go into an enemy's airspace, defended, probably by surface-to-air missiles, and you have to turn it into a permissive environment so you can do what you need to do, right? You're not shooting down the SAMs to shoot down the SAMs. You're shooting down the SAMs to get to whatever target. That's all you need stealth for, okay? Once it's a permissible environment, you don't need stealth anymore. Okay, and that's a critical thing to know because the cost of making something stealth drives up the cost about 300%. In other words, if I have a widget here that's non-stealthy, that does capability X, and I turn that widget into this over here, which is stealthy, the cost went up 300%. So are there different ways you could turn a non-permissive environment into a permissive environment? The answer is yes, and hypersonics is one of them, right? Now, if I can go into that non-permissive environment with hypersonics, not with a stealth airplane, I'm taking less risk. It's less money on cost per weapon system. So there's different ways. So it's important to me do we have the balance of technology right? You know, you don't want to overly invest in stealth and underinvest in hypersonics and realize you could have done the same thing for 10% of the cost. So I think the future isn't like you. It sounds like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but from the way you answer the question, I think like me, you think hypersonics is the key. And I think drones are the key. And the pairing of those two things, if it hasn't already become so already, will become a revolution in military affairs.
That was one of the things that's kind of been circling around my head. There have been a few things. The Oreshnik, I guess, for me, that was a real shock when I read the first story. Now, it didn't help that Kyiv originally said it was an ICBM, right? And my blood ran cold. I read that at like 4 a.m.
I saw that too, by the way, and I was like, "Whoa, hey, stakes just got hot." You know?
I was like, okay, you know what? We need to take a little breather here because we're at that point. But, it seems like we almost have this remix of technologies, and like part of it was this Oreshnik. It reminds me of a big bunker buster, but then both that and these kamikaze drones are reminiscent of kind of the V2 from World War II, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so there's a terror weapon aspect of it as well, you know.
Well, and that, again, I'm not in the policy-making business, but that was why Russia called it an ICBM, right? If it can hit in Ukraine, the whole definition of an ICBM, remember the IC stands for intercontinental, as opposed to intermediate range, short range, is that it can hit elsewhere. And so that was the nature of that. When you combine the long-range strikes with hypersonics, which, as I said earlier, are harder to detect, it was a psychological weapon. Now, don't overplay that either. Like I said, almost all of your ballistic missiles are hypersonic by nature. When folks talk hypersonic ballistic missiles, what they're usually referring to are the glide bombs, the ones that can change direction. That is a bigger threat. Because what makes a traditional ballistic missile targetable is that it's ballistic, right? You know when it went up, you know when it came down. You do the math real quick, you could hit it with a Patriot missile per se, or an Iron Dome, or a David Sling. But once they start moving on their own, they're more akin to the newer hypersonic missiles you're talking about. It's a much more difficult problem.
Yeah,
So
I'd wondered about that. I think that I saw Putin say something about that too, and I'd wondered if maybe that was just kind of icing on the cake. But I saw some quote that was something along the lines of, we're going to start producing these missiles or producing more of them,
right.
and by the way, they're hypersonic. You can't defend against them. And I did wonder about that. I thought, well, aren't
Yeah, so
ballistic missiles
he
coming
said
in?
something like that. I believe I read the same thing you did. I don't know that I would say you can't defend against them. If I said that, I apologize.
Yeah.
I misspoke. They are harder to defend. You can defend against anything, right? When I was at Georgia Tech, my one of my professors taught me the rule of 10%, which means anything you build can be defeated for 10% of the cost and built in 10% of the time, right? And that has proven correct, by the way. So there is, but it is much harder to detect and protect against a hypersonic low altitude cruise missile, and against a terminal hypersonic ballistic missile. Harder, not impossible. Again, you just saw the technology used in Israel. You're very effective,
Yeah.
I might add. And remember,
Well,
it wasn't just Israel, but open source reporting. We had pre-positioned our fighters, both Air Force and Navy, to intercept the cruise missiles that were coming in. Fantastic work of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and leadership, and individual pilot skill. I love that aspect of it.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, again, I'm the more that I learn about the United States military, the more incredibly impressive it is, And if there's one thing that I could share with the audience, it is that the work that is being done is mostly behind the scenes. And when people get in and start to learn about what's really being done and what our capabilities really are, they should be damn proud of the U.S. military.
You're spot on with that. And, besides being a tech nerd, the other reason I like being in the ISR world is because of that. The turning the use of technology into a greater good is something that I enjoy intrinsically in and of itself. The ability to take satellite imagery or raw data source and turn it into something which helps a decision maker do the right thing. It is a very from a self-fulfilling perspective, it makes you feel good about your mission. And I love the look in an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old imagery analyst when I can go and tell them, hey, that image you just did, President saw that a half hour ago and made a decision based off that. And their eyes just light up. It's fantastic. So, and that is something that's only been, the case for maybe 20 years. Intelligence was always something, you ask them a question, they tell you, well, we'll get on it later. But the use of intel as an operational asset has really evolved in the last 20 years. And it's been fantastic and fascinating to see.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I want to ask about drones specifically in terms of the Replicator initiative.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that is still under development, right? Secretary of Defense Hicks announced this back in August 2023. Again, I think this is Ukraine driving this forward. I just saw a video the other day about, believe it or not, it was drone-to-drone combat in the sky over Ukraine, and they were using a recoilless shotgun.
Yeah.
And I was just like, this is, from one day to the next, there's evolution happening.
Don't forget that.
The change is remarkable. And so with the Replicator initiative, this is kind of our foray into it. And the impression that I get was that they are moving a little bit more slowly to be able to do it right. And I'm wondering, do you think that we're going to be able to use lessons learned from the war in Ukraine to hopefully even be able to leapfrog what's happening there?
Yeah, so again, just like the CCA, I love the Replicator program. Probably no surprise to you or any of your listeners, right? I love the fact that Secretary Hicks is leading that. When I started at the beginning, we were talking about the MC-12 program, right? Having fielded that in just 8 months. The only reason we were able to do that was because Secretary Gates said, do it and brief me daily on it. All right? Otherwise, the bureaucracy would have stopped that in a heartbeat. For millions of reasons, not the least of which was it wasn't funded by anybody. So you're taking money. Okay, so what the Replicator has going for it is the fact that the current leadership wants it, right? And you have to have that. Remember the MRAP program, right? We had to field, we were losing lots of people to IEDs, and so we rapidly fielded an up-armored vehicle with a hull-shaped bottom to deflect the blast. And so that there's now a lot of folks walking around today that wouldn't be otherwise. Okay, again, that was a rapid fielding. Whenever you get any of this advanced technology You have to have the horsepower. So, of course, the biggest threat to the Replicator program is the fact that there's a changing administration, and it may or may not be a priority. And that's for someone way above my pay grade to decide. But I do like the Replicator. I think my only criticism really isn't a criticism. It's probably more of my own ignorance on it. Is, again, to do what, right? I understand you're trying to build lots of high-tech drones that can be built cheaply, inexpensive. But again, to do what? You have to do something with them. And I know they'll get that. That's not the hard part of the equation. But we failed in that before. If you go back to in Vietnam, the F-111, it was a bomber that was going to do everything. It was a fighter and a bomber. It was going to do everything. And what you got was a plane that could do nothing. Okay. And it was rapidly retired. And every nation, every service, the Marine Corps has a story about that. The Navy, I won't go into other people's dirty laundry. I'll stick with the Air Forces. But we had plenty of failures too. So I think there are, and I know the folks that are involved in that program, and there's some much bigger brains than mine, and they're working on that. But that does cause me pause. Is be careful. If you try to build something that does everything, you end up with something that does nothing. But as an initiator program, I like it. I just read Congress's report that came out last month on it, and I'm liking what I'm seeing. Ironically, I think the Replicator 2 program, which is the counter drone, right? The program to protect us against other nations' drones, I think that will actually end up being more successful than Replicator 1 because of the 10% rule I told you earlier about, right? They only have to, they have to counter what the other nations are doing, and you can usually do that in 10% of the time for 10% of the money. So I think that program will eventually prove very beneficial, and we'll see dividends from that very quickly. Probably
that is
Replicator 1, but.
That was what I'd wondered about. Replicator 2, I'd wondered about in terms of this New Jersey drone sighting thing, right?
Yeah.
Which may or may not be benign, may or may not be prosaic. And I saw a list the other day of, I think it was like 35 different cities and military bases and, sensitive places across the eastern seaboard where these things are appearing. And so it looks like there's kind of a follow-on effect. What I'm guessing is that, now it's just kids out there saying, hey, we can hit the news. Let's put our drone up in the air, but
I mix them both. And just for clarity, I'm not involved in that program or the counter to that program in any way. So I don't want to speculate on what it is, could be, or might be. But I would say that I would not write it off as not possibly being a threat. And we certainly know that capability is in the hands of our adversaries. And we certainly know that swarming, what sounds dramatic, is not all that complicated to program. So could it be? Sure. I'm not ready to say it's not, nor am I ready to say it is. I'm saying I don't know, and I sure would like to know. I'm in the business of finding the answer out. So I'm not as quick as some others are to write that off as not a threat. I think it very well could be. And it also could be exactly what you say it is, which are a bunch of kids out there having fun. And it's probably a little bit of both, right? The answer is normally somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Phil, let me thank you so much for your time today. Again, it has been truly a pleasure and truly an honor being able to interview you. And let me thank you one more time for your tremendous career of service to our country as well. Let me close by asking, what is coming up for you in the first part of 2025, and what do you foresee, if you're willing to make any predictions, about air power going into the new year?
Well, as for me, I'm fixing to retire. I'm already on casual retired status. I'm about to walk out the door. I'm gonna actually put my money where my mouth is on some of the things that we talked about today. I'm looking, going out in the industry, and I want to start a company for the peaceful use of drones. One of the things I'm looking at is anti-landmine. So right now, if you want to take landmines out, which is a problem, it's about to be a massive problem in Ukraine. Right, but already is a problem in the Baltics, the Balkans, excuse me, and other parts of the world. We do it the old-fashioned way. If a person with a metal detector going through, that's the way it's still done. And I believe that we could use drone swarms using sensors to rapidly find, identify, and probably even demine huge swaths. So that there's smaller companies that are investing that, but I'm looking at starting up a company that will do that. Make a serious effort to do that. Again, it goes back to the use of an ISR for the betterment of humanity, which appeals to my nature. And I think working in the getting landmines out would be would be something that I would enjoy it. So if you got any startup folks who are looking to talk to me about that, let me know. They can find me on LinkedIn or through your website, and I'll listen to what they have to say. But that's, I think, when moving on to industry is coming up for me next. And then I think we've talked about it mostly. I think that it's for the Air Force. I think we're going to continue this journey, which has been fascinating, into both the drones and then also satellites. And we talked about that at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
And then manned aircraft. I don't believe when people say, "Oh, the manned aircraft are going away." I just don't believe that. I think, there's always a person in the loop. By the way, it always cracks me up when people say, "Is manned aircraft going away?" I'm like, no, I mean, the person might be sitting someplace else, but even in a drone, there's still a person in the loop, right? They just might be sitting someplace else. So I think getting that nexus right, how much you're going to put up in space, how much you're going to put in manned assets, how much you're going to put in unmanned assets, and the degree to which you are prepared for that is what's going to dominate the military mind for the next decade, I think, on the Air Force on that topic.
Wonderful. Let me thank you again so much for your time today, sir.
Yeah, thank you. It's been an honor, and I hope anything I said was helpful to you.